Hello, this is Hit Record, the fortnightly FAQ for podcast. It's hosted by me, Charles Commins. I'm a freelance podcast producer and presenter. I'm also a voiceover artist, but I'm going to be concentrating mostly on podcasting for this channel. On this episode, I'm going to be talking about 5 episodes that every podcaster makes, yes, including me, and how you can avoid them. Before we get into that though, I'd really like it if you could hit the like button for me and maybe even press subscribe so that therefore you'll see my videos pop up every time I release a new one. So, 5 mistakes. Let's get on with it, shall we? Number 1, not checking your settings before you hit record. I have done this on more than one occasion. I usually record my podcast on Zencastr, which is an online recording platform. Basically, a nice little website that allows me and my friends to get together online and record our podcast together. Now, what I have to remember to do is to plug in my microphone. I also need to then remember to tell my laptop that this is the microphone I want you to record from. And then I also need to tell Zencastr that this is the microphone, please, that I want you to listen to me speaking through. And I have to do that with not just me, but I also need to do it with my co-hosts as well. Now, what has happened in the past is that I've kind of gone, I haven't done a recording since the last episode. It'll all be fine. I've done my recording and I then have pulled in my audio into my editing software only to discover that rather than this lovely shiny microphone that I spent a lot of money on being used to record my voice, instead Zencastr chose to use my inbuilt microphone in my laptop. I sounded like I was in the next room rather than being right here in front of the microphone, so it made for a quite terrible sounding episode, or at least it did on my part. My co-hosts, they sounded fine because they had checked their settings. So don't be like me. Just every single time that you're about to hit record, just double check. Check to make sure that your microphone's turned on. Check to make sure that whatever recording platform it is that you're using knows which microphone it is that you want it to take the audio from, and you won't have a problem. Number 2, you don't edit your podcast. This is a contentious one because I often will hear people say, well, Joe Rogan doesn't edit his podcast. And that might be true, but Joe Rogan's been doing it for a number of years now, and his podcast identity is one of essentially a radio show where he gets guests in and he chats with them very naturally, and you get to hear the whole conversation. But the one thing that Joe Rogan is very good at doing is making sure that he leads that conversation and that the interview doesn't really ever stray too far off track, away from stuff that his audience will find interesting and that they'll be entertained by. It might take a while for you to get to that point. And so what I would suggest that you always do as a podcaster is edit the audio that you've recorded. Think about what your audience is going to find interesting or entertained by when you're doing the editing. A handy little trick and a handy thing to think about while you're doing the editing is my audience going to miss this if I cut it out? If you don't think that the audience are going to care that whatever it is that you've just heard yourself say will be there in the podcast or not, then cut it out. The audience are not going to remember something that they didn't hear. So don't worry about that side of things. Edit your podcast to make it as good as possible. Cut out all of the waffle. Don't necessarily cut out mistakes. They can be quite funny and entertaining. But do cut out stuff that just isn't interesting or on topic, or what you think your audience will like to hear from you when they press play on your podcast. Number 3, publishing your podcast without listening back to it yourself. Okay, so how many times have you recorded your podcast, then edited it, and then uploaded and released it without doing a final listen through and trying to hear it the way that your audience will listen to it? Yeah, I've done it quite a lot of times too. Essentially, if you listen to your podcast the way that you think your audience will listen to it, so maybe it's while you're out on a walk, pair of headphones in, maybe it's on a drive, coming out of your car speakers, whatever way that you think that your audience listens to your podcast the most, you go and replicate that before pressing go and letting anybody else hear it. You'll make sure that you won't deafen your audience too much. You haven't made your podcast too loud. And vice versa, you haven't made it too quiet that they can't hear it, even if they turn their volume all the way up. There might be certain points that actually are quite quiet compared to other points. Have you checked that out? If you've been editing on fancy headphones like this, these are designed for you to actually be able to hear a lot better and a lot more information. Now that's great for you as an editor, but most of your audience won't hear this. Most of your audience will be listening on something like this. And if they are, then they're not necessarily going to hear every detail that you can in your big cans. So before you hit publish, go and listen to the podcast the way that your audience will listen to it. That way, you'll know exactly what it is that they're hearing when they press play on their podcast app and choose to listen to you. Number 4, only using social media to promote your podcast. What I mean by this is that you'll get onto Twitter, onto Instagram or Facebook, and every week you put a post out saying, go and listen to the new episode of my podcast. It's great. Here's a link to make it easy. That's absolutely fine. You should do that. Make sure that you're reaching your audience and you're telling them that you've got a podcast that you think that they would find interesting to listen to. But if that's the only thing that you're doing with social media, you run the risk of actually annoying people rather than getting more people to listen. All you need to do to fix this is to join in with the conversations that your target audience are actually having online. Go and find a Facebook group or find a Twitter chat that is talking about a similar subject or exactly the same subject that you do every week on your podcast and join in with that conversation. You don't have to mention that you've got a podcast. Pop it in your bio or your About Me section of your social media handle. That way that people that find you interesting in that conversation and decide to click to find out a little bit more about you will see there and then, oh, they've got a podcast, and make sure you put a link there as well. That way, those people will be able to click straight through to listen to it as soon as they find you. But when you're using social media, just think about the conversations that you're having. That's what it was designed for people to do, is to have conversations with each other online in real time. So don't forget to do it. Sure, publish a post every week saying, this is my podcast, go and listen to it, there's a new episode. But don't make that every single post. You'll just annoy people. Number 5, thinking you need thousands of people listening to be successful. This is a big one. Every podcaster that I've ever spoken to at the start of their journey thinks that they need to have thousands upon thousands of listeners and downloads for their podcast to be successful. It's simply not true. And in fairness, it's a fault of the podcasting industry, especially when it comes to monetizing your podcast. Think about all those different hosts that say, if you have 10,000 listeners a podcast episode or above, you'll be able to monetize your podcast by joining our advertising program. But there's not that many podcasts that actually get 10,000 listens per episode. So you're pushing yourself to go and be up there with the big boys right from the very beginning. And if you don't get there within 7 episodes, most people tend to quit. So stop thinking that you need that amount of people listening to be a success. I record in this room, which is quite small. In fact, I would argue that if you got more than 4 people in here at one time, you'd probably feel quite claustrophobic. But if I had 3 people listening in here along with me to me recording my podcast, and I had an audience of that size, and it wasn't just my wife and my child or my parents, then I'd say that that's pretty successful, that I've managed to draw those people in to actually listen to me. My podcast gets around about 400 people listening to it every week. That's brilliant. If I tried to squeeze 400 people into my living room, well, you wouldn't fit that many people in, full stop. So I'd sell out my house pretty quickly every week if I sold tickets to come and listen to it being recorded live. That is amazing. And you should always think about the fact that your audience is growing and that the people that are listening clearly want to listen, are enjoying what you're putting out. So just because there aren't several zeros at the end of your download figures, don't worry about it. Your podcast is a success. You're far better off finding a different way of measuring the success of your podcast than by how many people are listening to it. Maybe you can sell something through your podcast. Maybe that's through an advertisement that you get from a sponsorship campaign. Maybe it's a workshop that you're putting on or an event. Maybe even make some merchandise, like a mug, for instance. If you do that and then choose to measure the success of your podcast based on how many people sign up or buy from you for those things, then you're far more likely to see that your podcast is successful than if you're measuring it based on how many people are listening. Of course, you might decide that you only need 3 people listening for your podcast to be a success. And if that is the number that you want to use, go for it. I'm sure that will make you very happy. Just don't aim so high that it's unrealistic. So there you go. There's the 5 mistakes that I think every podcaster makes and how to avoid making them. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, do give it a thumbs up down in that bit down there. And if you've got any other mistakes that you think you've made before when you're podcasting and ideas on how you can avoid to do that, then leave me a comment below. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be back next time on Hit Record.